Yeah, my name's Stephen Robinson. I'm currently the technical co-founder of a new company called MelbCSS. Before that I was CTO and co-founder of Style Education, if you've heard about it. But you can find me around the internet as CubeDye. I'm CubeDye everywhere. And I want to talk about the ins and outs of inputs. Obviously everyone's tried to style inputs and buttons before, and everyone knows it's super difficult. It's painful. You end up with a huge mess of CSS, a pixel here, margin there, to make things line up properly. It annoyed me enough to go digging in browser source code, dev tools, form, browser CSS to work out what's going on. And I could stand here for 3 weeks telling you about all the stuff that doesn't work or is really weird. But I'll tell you about the couple of major things I've found that will make everything a lot easier to deal with. What I won't be showing you today is how to build really nice looking things, but I'll explain how things are broken so that you can deal with it yourself. But first, a bit of history. Web browser's been around since the web in 1990. The form elements made it to the spec in 94, and until the CSS spec, the browser had to style it themselves and make it look semantically correct. Even when CSS came out, it wasn't until 2000, then I think IE5 maybe had the closest full implementation. So during that time, and browsers still do need to be able to render a HTML page without CSS. Otherwise, all your websites would just look like this. Not that useful. Your form elements would just be boxes that you couldn't see. Your buttons would just look like more text. So obviously when you start a new website, you go and download the next latest and greatest reset sheet, and it'll swipe away all your browser styles. And they're not going anywhere soon, but they don't quite reset everything, especially inputs and buttons. And as we go through some of the code samples, you'll see why. There's some problems. There's lots of internal pseudo elements inside the code that you can't actually get to with normal CSS. There's a few things you can do. There are internal browser styles as well that you can't overwrite, and the browser's actually hard-coded some of their decisions into their source code that you'll never be able to touch. So they're the big things. So how did I end up here? As I said, I set out to build a UI kit for a product, one of my products, where you could have buttons together, links together, you could put buttons and inputs next to each other, everything would line up great. So I set out on that journey and things didn't go quite so well. And after about 2 or 3 weeks of banging my head against the desk, I decided to open up source code and have a look at what was going on. So I found some simple solutions to these elements that will certainly make everything better for you. I'm not going to talk about all the input types because there's heaps of them, but I'll talk about the ones that are the most important. So a lot of the problems, especially with inputs, stem when you set height. If you want to build a UI kit for things, you want all your controls to be the same height. I like 3M, this is 3.5. And when you want to start having weird padding like this. So say you've got an input like this, and then when you focus on it, you want to put the label up the top so you can type in it. Obviously you've got to make more space at the top, and everything sort of has to line up. But this is really hard to do if you don't know what's going on. So we'll just keep going through. So we'll start with the button tag first. Everyone has buttons, and somewhere in there you're going to want to do this. You want to put a button next to a link that looks like a button, and when you add some backgrounds and some borders, you get this. And this is really annoying. You kind of have a few options. You can make your button a link tag with an on-click, but it's not really what links are for. I could do a whole nother talk on links and buttons and when to use the right one. So I went digging, and I found this little bit of code in the Firefox source code. It's in form CSS. It basically says there's this magic element called button content, and you can't style it like that. You can put that in your CSS code, but it doesn't do anything if you try and override it. And it just makes the content inside a block element that you can't get to. So I was like, well, that kind of makes sense. That's why the content is the size it is. And I was like, how do I make this inherit the line height or the height of the button? So with a 3em button, content's always going to be sitting in the middle. And the reason that is if you just take a normal div and put some text content in it, it'll be the height of the text content. And so that's basically what you're getting here. But this didn't explain why it was vertically centered. So I dug a little bit further. And we got into this reflow button contents inside the HTML button control frame renderer inside Firefox. And I found this little bit of code. And it basically says, we're going to render that child vertically. And it goes and calculates your height and how big the content is, and basically says it's going to be right there in the center. So that was the next thing that I got to, and I'm like, okay, cool. How am I going to get my button to look like a link? So I played around for a bit more, looked through some more code, and I found out that the button content element that's there, it's not even a real element. And so the children, if you put children inside your button, it will, if you put your children inside the button element, you can inherit the styles from the button itself and skip over this element. So that got me thinking, what if we wrap the content in another element? And then we can skip over this content thing and be done with it. So I tried a few things. I put a div in there, and that kind of worked, and I got this approach. But if you look in the spec, buttons can't have divs inside them. But you can have a span. And if we just open up the CSS here, you can, it's not going to load now. You can make a display block and inherit height, and CSS will render it like this. So the span that's wrapped up the word button is now inheriting the height from the button. So now it's 3em to match the link, and because it's a span and it's just a block element, your text will live at the top. So this is great. Now we've got our button and link, and they kind of look the same. So the next thing I decided to do was, what if we styled that span to look like a button? And that ended up working out really well, and it gives you this advantage as well, that when you want to make your link look like a button, you can just wrap the contents up in the same span, and you'll get the same looking design for both. If you want to make a div look like a button or any sort of other element, you can just give it the class button, put your content in a span, and away you go. So now we have our button control bar. Everything lines up, everything looks great. So that was kind of, that's the button tag. Just, I can't really explain a better way to do it, but if you've got one, let me know. But the span wrapping definitely helps. So I thought, awesome, now I'm going to build one of those little cool search boxes where it's got the input and the button next to it, and they'll line up and they'll look great. But they don't. Page content here is just a span, it's just your line of text. I've just put a border around it so you can see that it's not doing anything weird, it's just purely in line with the baseline of the other content, but you can see that the button doesn't quite line up with the input. And you can notice here also that the input's been chopped off. This is why there's P's here, you can see the P's been chopped off and the I's been chopped off. This only happens in Firefox. In Chrome, it does the right thing. I think I might have here's a code pen. So this is the same setup. It's got, you can see this text here is visible, it's not chopped off. The main reason this is chopped off is, I've got another thing here, I'll just show you. So this is it in Firefox. Wow. The input height's 2.5 em, we've squashed the padding down to 1 em top and bottom. The only space left is half an em, which is why everything's being chopped off. And so basically your input kind of looks a bit like this internally. There's a div, it's got another div inside it, and that's it being chopped off with divs, just to give you some idea of what's actually going on there. So this is half the problem. The input, it's a multi-purpose tag. It can be all of those things, it can look like all of those things, and if you're going to implement this as a browser, you're probably going to do some magic to make it swap in and out of what things should look like. So if we group these together, we've got the text types. These are things you can type into: date, times, numbers, text, password fields. These are the ones I'm going to talk most about because they're the easiest to style. The second, we've got the checkable things. You've got your radio buttons, you've got checkboxes. And then you've got these things that look like buttons and function like buttons, and we'll talk very briefly about those. And then you've got these other ones. I haven't had enough time to work out how to play with these, but I know there's a few hacks to get your file input to look however you want, which is like zoom it out and hide it with opacity behind something that looks like what you want. So we'll just try and stay away from these ones. So as I was saying, input tag can be a lot of things. If you go and dig around in the Chrome debugger tool and turn on Shadow DOM, you can see it's all implemented in secrets underneath. The top one's your text input. It's just got a div called inner editor, and when you type in the input, that's where the text ends up. But if you look at something like the range, it's got a few different elements. You've got the slider and the thumb that you drag around and those sort of things. So, it kind of does everything. And because the input can't have children, they can afford to hide all this secrecy inside there, unlike the button element where you can wrap stuff in a span. But that also makes making it look right really hard. So, thought I'd just try the old, let's see if we can get to that inner element here. Doesn't work. But these pseudo elements that you might have seen here, where it says pseudo WebKit slider runnable track, you can get to that with this little bit here. But it is browser specific, and as far as I know, I don't know what the magic's called on Firefox, but on WebKit browsers you can use this, and you can style the little thumb thing however you like. Makes sense. So you set out to design your new input. You've probably got some sort of reset thing that looks like this. Everyone's had it. You've probably, if you download whatever latest and greatest reset, there'll be something that looks like this in there. And for those that have probably heard about it, you've probably heard about appearance none in CSS. These are the same controls with appearance none on it. For reference, this is what they look like with it off. This is what it looks like with it on. So not really helping us at all. And it's also been dropped from the CSS3 UI spec. And there's a few limited implementations, Firefox and WebKit. I'm not going to talk about select menus, but one job it does really good with is removing that little down arrow on your select menu so you can put a background image and some padding off the side and make it look pretty. But in CSS4 UI spec, there is something that resembles what this is going to do, but it's in really early draft, and I'm not sure if my internet's working, but we'll open this up and have a look. Oh, here we go. So this is the grand plan to do what you expected to do, which is take all those browser styles off, and then you scroll down and there's a few issues, and IE supports WebKit appearance as well, and we're not really sure what that's going to do. But once you actually start looking through the source code, this is going to take a long time, because a lot of those decisions about how big things should be and how properties should exist on these elements, they're all pretty much hard-coded. So we're going to have a real time waiting for that to happen. But there's hope. One day we may get to the point where we can go appearance none, and your stuff will just look like a div, and you can start again from scratch. So now that we've broken them down, we'll talk about the text types. They're obviously easiest to style. Most of the inner workings will inherit from the parent, so text decoration, font size, padding, that sort of stuff will actually work properly. But like buttons, their content is vertically centered as well. So when you want to have that, like that email field I started with the padding on the top and the bottom, it gets a bit interesting. And I showed you how things are clipped in Firefox and not in Chrome with the content. So I went playing around. I read through, I think it was like 5 or 6 files deep of these inputs and how they're implemented. And it treats the box sizing border box more like padding box, and it doesn't take into account the border heights when it's calculating the baseline for the text and the input, and that's why you get this sort of behavior where the input's a bit lower and the button's a bit higher when you add borders. This obviously is without borders. When you put the borders on, you get this weird behavior. Not ideal when you want your buttons and inputs to line up together, because, well, obviously they don't line up. These are huge sizes, but when you're like 1 or 2 pixels off, it doesn't quite look right. It looks a bit dirty. So back to that first example I had, we have this. If we just remove the padding from the border height from the bottom, it'll line everything up again, because it'll take it out of the content space, and then your line heights will line up again. And this is probably the best use of calc I've ever seen. So this is great. Now we have these buttons and inputs, and obviously that bit of space is there because they're in line block and there's a space there, but if you take that out and you can add your rounded corners and everything looks great, and you've got what you wanted. So if you want to just have a quick look at the CSS here, if you'll look. So we've got our reset sheet, our borders. I've just made the input, the size sort of fit on that screen, but it doesn't fit because my resolution's changed. And then I've just styled my button and that little span inside the button to be the same thing. Without that span, you get a different behavior with the button where it sort of jumps upwards of the input instead of down. So the span thing solved that for me as well. So there's another reason to use that span wrapping inside your buttons. And obviously, I don't think this is going to load all the way down. But yeah, that's that. All that's at the bottom there is that little input padding thing going on there. All right, so those are like the two main things you can use, and I'll reiterate it again at the end. Wrapping your content, your buttons in spans, and just being aware that borders on inputs don't get calculated in their line height baseline, so you end up with this behavior which you've just seen, where the inputs aren't quite right. The checkable types, they're actually implemented with background layers. So if you have a look in the shadow DOM there, there's nothing. There's nothing you can see, nothing you can get to, nothing you can sort of do with it. If you've seen any of those hacks around the internet where you get a label and you sort of stick it over the top of the checkbox and you make that look like an image, it's the best way to do it right now. The only thing I can suggest you remember is that the input with the label with the text for the input goes before the label with the picture in it that you want to use the checkbox. The reason for that is some screen readers will only read the first label they find. So if you have checkbox label with the actual label in it, it won't read anything because it'll skip over that first one. So this is where like wrapping things in divs as whole containers, and you can position your stuff over to the side and keep your labels there. I didn't feel the need to show that hack. You can find that online somewhere. But while I was digging around, I did find this little bit of code here, which basically sort of stretches out your input, your checkbox like this, but it'll center it inside whatever box you have. But this only happens in Firefox. In Chrome, you get something that looks like this, where it's still the same size, it's stuck off to the left, and the space is just taken up by the space. So there's these browser configurations that you can't get around. I didn't look through the Chrome source code because it's got a lot of magic stuff because Google's had their hands on it. But the Firefox source code is just straight C++, so you can kind of read through it. There's also some really awesome comments in there about doing stuff because that's how IE does it or how Chrome does it. So they're all kind of in cahoots with each other. It's like, well, they've done it like this, so we'll do it like that as well. And it's not in the spec. It doesn't say anything in the spec, and even when you find things in the spec, it kind of says, you know, at the implementer's discretion. My favorite one is still toFixed in JavaScript. The spec says 0 to 20, and then after that, it's up to the browsers to implement whether toFixed 21 will give you 21 or throw an error, and browsers do different things. So that's a good one as well to keep in mind. The spec is a bit open to interpretation. The other type is obviously the buttons. These have all been re-implemented as button elements. Suggest you just use them as button elements. They suffer from the same issue as the buttons, but you can't have those child spans to make things work properly. So you're just going to have a hard time trying to make your input button look like a button, and it's just easier to skip over them completely and just turn them into normal buttons. So as I said before, these are just two of the takeaways, but they're probably the ones that I come up against all the time when I'm building stuff with CSS. Wrap your button elements in a span that's a block element. It'll make everything easier. And just take into account those border widths when you're working out why your inputs don't quite line up with things next to them. So I don't think I've got much else here. I did want to touch on this though. Don't despair, don't give up, don't go make divs that have on-click handlers. These controls have a lot of power in them. They work with mobile devices, so you select menu, will bring up the little menu. If you re-implement it yourself, you're not going to have that benefit. They're accessible, they work with labels, they have all the keyboard shortcuts, they have focus and the right events and everything. And a screen reader is going to know that they're there. If you do that with a div, you find that you're going to have to do a lot of work to make that happen, whether it's more padding, more on click, what happens with a select when you press the down button. If you re-implement it yourself, you've got to navigate through that list. So although some of the results may not be quite what you want and you'll have to compromise, it's definitely worth it. I've kind of started a project in my spare time to document some of this in nice CSS, sort of with all the comments and why stuff's there. When I do get around to finishing that or open sourcing it, I will let everyone know. I've got through the reset style sheet at least. I started again, I opened up all the browsers, and I went through it one by one. So that's pretty well done. Anyway, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer your questions. Otherwise, I may come back next year with more things that I found that don't quite work.